Plot holes are one of movie and TV audiences' least favorite things. They can cause problems in otherwise great stories, and even totally ruin our suspension of disbelief. But as much as viewers might like to rag on them, they aren't always as big of a deal as we might imagine. Sometimes we don't even realize they were there until way after the fact. And a lot of things that have been called plot holes aren't actually at all. So let's take a look at why plot holes happen in media, some of the biggest ones ever put to screen, and if they really even matter at all. We'll be touching on some key points from these films and shows, so just a heads up about possible spoilers. In conversations about movies and TV shows, the pendulum has swung from viewers actively seeking out plot holes, and often claiming just about everything is one, to the exact opposite, where no one seems to agree if anything is actually a plot hole. So first, let's quickly break down what a plot hole really is. Plot holes are issues that create inconsistencies within stories that break the internal logic of the film or show. They're not just small accidental flubs or continuity errors that might be noticeable but don't actually affect anything. Characters just making a bad choice or doing something that doesn't really make sense isn't automatically a plot hole either. People do and say silly or ridiculous things all of the time. And just because a character does so on screen doesn't mean there's a failure in the plot. Just the opposite, in fact. It's often a deliberate part of the character's personality or their growth journey.
I went back to season 1 of Fringe to check for plot holes. As I suspected, airtight.
Plot holes are an issue because, like the name suggests, they mess with the plot itself. They go against the logic of the world as it's existed up until that point in a way that can cause the entire story to begin to fall apart, and as a result can also break our immersion. Plot holes can come in many shapes and sizes, but the ones we see most often on screen tend to fall into a few main categories. Character not having knowledge or an ability that they definitely should just to further the story. This isn't always a plot hole. As we'll unpack in a moment, sometimes this is a deliberately used story device. But when it doesn't seem to be purposefully planned, things can start to feel a little weird. Take Gravity, where during a pivotal moment, veteran astronaut Matt and mission specialist Ryan both forget basic physics. They're tethered together, and Matt tells Ryan that she needs to cut him loose so that they're not both pulled out into the abyss. But that's not how space works. She could have easily pulled him towards her, and they could have both been fine. But he needed to die for the story, and so she cut him free and some mysterious force pulled him out into the beyond. Gossip Girl ended up retroactively creating this plot hole for itself when, in the final episode, it's revealed that lonely boy Dan Humphrey was Gossip Girl all along. So all of those times where he was just shocked by a Gossip Girl blast while sitting all by himself make a lot less sense in hindsight. There's a recurring subtrope of this type that often happens on television, where two characters meet for the first time multiple times, like Sam and Cat meeting during the iCarly and Victorious crossover episode, only to then seem to not know each other at all during the first episode of their spin-off show. Our friends Chandler and Rachel, who meet for the first time on 3 separate occasions. In the pilot, in the flashback when Rachel runs into Monica before her wedding, and when they met as teens. These kind of plot holes certainly aren't story ruining, but they can make it difficult to really nail down character relationships and backstories. This can also happen in the other direction, where a character all of a sudden has knowledge or an ability that's directly contradictory to what we know about them. For example, in Twilight, it's made clear that Alice can't see the shapeshifters. But then, in Breaking Dawn, she is somehow able to see the wolves in a key premonition. The most common plot holes are points when an event takes place that then upends the sense of the entire rest of the story, because it doesn't at all fit with the world as we've come to understand it. The butterfly effect is all about how even the smallest changes in the past can have major effects on the future. Except that one time Evan goes back in time to stab himself just to prove a point, and nothing at all changes except the appearance of the scar. And there's also the issue of how this would even prove anything, because in this new reality, he would have always had the scar. Many fans have been bothered by the inconsistencies around how the shrinking of mass in Ant-Man breaks its own internal logic. He gets to keep his full mass and strength when shrunk down, but then other large things like buildings and tanks are made light enough to easily carry around when they are shrunk down. Sometimes something will be set up or revealed within a story that seems to totally change everything, but then is completely forgotten to a degree that feels totally illogical. There are a few occurrences of this in the A Quiet Place franchise. In the original, everyone questioned why, if they knew that the waterfall allowed them to safely talk freely, did they instead choose to live in the middle of an incredibly quiet farm? In the recent sequel, A Quiet Place Day 1, We're told explicitly that New York City is incredibly loud, much louder than a waterfall, and yet this doesn't seem to help mask any of the human noise. The Harry Potter films also encountered this issue with the introduction of the time turners, which don't create a plot hole in the film in which they appear, but instead create one for essentially the entire rest of the story, because so much could have been solved via their use. It's put forth that no one uses them because they're too dangerous, but then why would anyone ever give one to a third-year student? Plot holes seem like something that any writer would work hard to avoid, but they can actually happen for a number of different reasons. Sometimes the writers just don't really care about the why or the how and are instead just looking to get certain scenes or themes into their story no matter what, logical or not. The aliens from Signs, for example, are often brought up as a huge plot hole. Why would aliens who know they're deathly allergic to water invade a planet that is made up mostly of water? But it provides the humans a simple, earthly way to overcome the aliens, using the thing that is the essence of our life to save ourselves. And M. Night Shyamalan is more interested in interesting metaphors than logical consistency. Plot holes are often just a result of issues slipping through the cracks. Movie scripts can go through dozens of rewrites before they make it to the screen. And sometimes something that made sense in Draft 2 doesn't make sense at all by the final version because things that were directly related to it were removed or changed to the point that now the connection is gone. This can also happen in television, but there they also have to deal with the fact that the story is being written over a very long period of time, often years. There are people whose job it is to try to keep up with all of the plot and continuity information, but they're also trying to do 100 other things at once too, and so sometimes things just slip through the cracks.
Another plot hole.
Well, yeah. I mean, you guys are aware, there's like so many plot holes.
Other times, plot holes can arise as the result of deliberate changes, specifically meant to break the existing logic of a story to turn things in a different direction. In stories that are written by multiple people, say TV shows, or movie series that have different writers for each installment, sometimes a writer will just decide that they no longer want to be bound by what came before and make some changes, even if that then leads to a plot hole.
This coming from the guy who's had how many psychotic breaks on campus?
Are we including the gaslight gear?
Take that Diana's Gossip Girl plot hole we mentioned earlier. That was actually a deliberate change on the part of the creative team. They were initially going to go with someone else. Many speculated that it would be Eric, who would have made a lot more sense, but were unhappy that people seemed to be figuring it out so early along in the show's run, and so eventually decided to just go in a totally different direction. Ridley Scott, who wrote and directed Alien, famously disliked the sequel Alien vs. Predator. So when he was back at the helm for Prometheus, he deliberately contradicted various plot lines in that story to essentially remove it from the Alien canon. Even the most carefully plotted story can be torn to pieces by a studio exec who is more interested in what they think will sell than anything else. Sometimes things have to be changed to fit what they think audiences will like more, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense. Some consider the machine's decision to use humans for battery power in The Matrix to be a plot hole, but they were actually initially meant to be used as processors. But the studio didn't think that the audiences would understand the brain-computer connection, and so forced the change. In the long-running discussions about plot holes, there are some things that have been named as such that aren't really at all. Many have called the fact that the Wizard of Oz's Dorothy technically could have clicked her heels and went home at any time a plot hole. But the entire point was that she had to go on the journey to learn how much she did care about her home, and that she should believe in herself, and it was only then that she was ready to return.
I should have thought of it for you. I should have felt it in my heart.
No, she had to find it out for herself. Now those magic slippers will take you home in 2 seconds.
While the Just Take the Eagle solution was a favorite of list makers for a long time, Lord of the Rings fans have debunked that alleged plot hole at length. Giant eagles are not terribly sneaky modes of transportation. Andy's use of a poster to cover his escape route in The Shawshank Redemption was a sticking point for some viewers, because it seemed impossible that he could have gotten it up from inside the hole. But really, he could have just stuck it to the top, climbed in, put glue around the remaining edges, and released the poster down and let it stick itself to the wall. One alleged plot hole that it seems will never go away is the idea that both Jack and Rose could have fit on the door in Titanic. But it's not a plot hole at all, instead just a result of people not actually watching what's happening in the scene. He does go to get on the door, but realizes that his weight will pull it down considerably, meaning it won't keep Rose out of the water, or could even flip it entirely, and so he instead makes the decision to stay in the water. But for some people, because this was all relayed visually instead of having Jack narrate his decision-making process aloud, it's been stuck in plot hole canon ever since, even though it is, again, very much not a plot hole. Since plot holes have become such a major point of contention, it can feel like they're incredibly important parts of storytelling that must be avoided at all costs. But that isn't really the case. Sure, particularly egregious ones can throw off a story or disrupt our suspension of disbelief, and that is a bummer. But other times, the storytelling is done so well that plot holes are able to sneak by without really disturbing any enjoyment of the media, even if they do make the story a little confusing when you sit down to think about it. Sometimes living with some plot holes can even be the better option creatively. Take Community. Creator Dan Harmon was axed by the studio for the 4th season. And over the course of that season, a lot of choices were made for the characters and plot that weren't ideal. He was brought back for the 5th season, and instead of getting stuck trying to move forward, keeping all of the changes from season 4, and trying to get back to the show people actually enjoyed simultaneously, he came up with a funny way to essentially just hand-wave away that entire season. All of the odd behavior was able to be written off as just a result of a gas leak at the school. It became dubbed the gas leak year, and the team was able to move forward without having to worry about creating any story-breaking plot holes.
What happened to Annie, the unstoppable go-getter?
Oh, there was that gas leak last year.
While they can definitely be fun to search for and point out, plot holes aren't always the show or movie ruiners that many have branded them. It's certainly best for writers to avoid them with a little creativity when possible, but they're not the end of the world. Don't miss our videos analyzing the best and worst plot twists and redemption arcs on screen.
That's The Take. Click here to watch the video we think you'll love, or here to check out a whole playlist of awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.